Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 4, the Legislative Branch, and it's Lesson 1 about the characteristics of Congress. In this lesson, you will learn about the original balance of power between the three branches of government, about bicameral legislatures, about the composition of the House of Representatives, about the House of Representatives and the Senate, about the selection of members for the House of Representatives and for the Senate, and about qualifications of members for the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, previously in this course, I've shown you this diagram about separation of powers within the national government. At that time, I used the diagram just to illustrate the fact that the national government was divided into three branches. Now, in the diagram, the three branches were represented by equally sized circles. This is to symbolically show that they are considered co-equal branches within the national government, each just as legitimate as the others, each with an opportunity to have powers over the other and check them. But the truth is that it was always foreseen that they would be unequal branches. There was an assumption at the time that the Constitution was written that the legislative branch should be by far the most powerful, and the judicial branch by far the weakest. The reason for this is that the legislative branch makes the laws. The executive then just executes the laws that the legislative branch makes, and the judicial branch just judges whether you've obeyed the laws that the legislative branch has made. So everything traces it back to the legislative branch as being the source of the power of the national government. Now, by the end of this course, you'll be able to reflect back on this slide and decide for yourself whether you think this original idea of where the balance of power should be is in fact where it remained during our country's history. Now, the legislative branch, though, is further divided, as we've already noted previously in the course. The legislative branch consists of, in fact, two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. A legislature that's divided into two houses we call a bicameral legislature. And as you previously learned, and we'll emphasize again as we go through this lesson today, the House of Representatives is based on population, while the Senate has representation for each state that is equal, 2 senators for each state. And like I said, we'll talk more about that later in this lesson. The way we're going to organize this lesson is talk about 3 ways that we can compare these two houses of Congress. The first way that we're going to compare is their composition. In other words, how they're made up, how they're composed. The United States Constitution says that the Senate will be composed of 2 senators from each state, as I mentioned a moment ago. While the Constitution says that the representatives in the House of Representatives will be apportioned among the states according to their respective numbers. In other words, what this means is that representation in the House, rather than being based on every state being equal, is based on population. So a state with a larger number of people would get a larger number of representatives. A state with a relatively smaller number would get a smaller number of representatives. Now, when the Constitution was first ratified, it stated that each state would get X number of representatives, and then it provided a mechanism where after every 10 years there would be a counting of the people in the country. We call it the census. And based on that, additional seats would be added to the House of Representatives. And that continued through the country's history for about 140 years, with the House continually expanding as the population grew, until its numbers were reaching nearly 500 people in the House of Representatives. Then in 1929, a law was passed called the Permanent Apportionment Act, which capped the size of the House of Representatives at 435 members. That's the size that the House had reached under the previous census that had been enforced. And so while it should have jumped up to around 480 some, after the 1920 census, agreement couldn't be reached on doing it. And so eventually they decided to just cap the number at 435, and that's where it's been ever since. Now, this has some consequences for the House of Representatives that we'll talk about later in this unit. And that is, as population shifts, not only will some states have seats added as their population grows, but because the number is capped at 435, some states will actually lose seats in the House of Representatives. But we'll talk about that later in this unit in a different lesson. So to summarize the difference in composition between the House and the Senate is composed of 100 members, with 2 coming from each state. Because we have 50 states, we end up with 100 senators. If we added another state, we'd have 102. It's just 2 from each state for a total of 100 as the United States is currently constituted. The House of Representatives is based on population. The number of seats each state gets varies depending on how large or small its population is compared to the other states. But the total number has been capped by law since 1929 at 435 total members. Despite that cap, as you can see, the House remains more than 4 times as big as the Senate, and that'll have some consequences for how they do business there that we'll talk about in a later lesson. The second way we want to compare the 2 houses of Congress is how their members are selected. In the United States Senate, the senators, 2 from each state, are chosen originally as the Constitution is written here. And I say originally because we're going to see a change to it as we continue on with this unit. But originally, it was done so that the Constitution was composed so that the legislatures of each state would choose the senators to represent their state. They weren't actually elected by anybody. They were simply selected by the state legislature. The state legislature is the governing body of that state. Now, when the state legislature chose the senators, it was choosing them for 6-year terms. And they were staggered so that every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for renewal, I guess you could say. Not re-election because they weren't getting elected yet. So what happens is every 2 years, 1/3 of the senators, their seats are vacated and the legislatures have to pick again to fulfill them. Now, they can pick the same people, but they had to pick again. And then once somebody is selected for the Senate, they sit there for 6 years until their term comes up again. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the senators have their 6-year terms expire. The House of Representatives, in contrast, all come up for re-election every 2 years. And they are selected not by the state legislatures of their state, but instead by the people of their states. So now let me summarize the difference in how the members of the House and Senate are selected. The Senate, as things were originally set up in the Constitution, is chosen by the state legislatures, each state choosing its 2 senators. The senators are chosen for 6-year terms, and 1/3 of them have to come up to be reseated every 2 years. House of Representatives, in contrast, are directly elected by the people, and they're 2-year terms. Now, because the House is elected every 2 years, all of them, and because 1/3 of the senators are getting elected every 2 years we have a national election in this country. The third way we're going to compare the 2 houses of Congress is by looking at the qualifications of their members. In other words, what basic characteristics do you have to be able to serve as a member of the House or the Senate? The Constitution says that a senator has to be at least 30 years of age and been a citizen of the United States for at least 9 years. The Constitution says that a representative needs only be 25 years of age and only has to be a citizen of the United States for 7 years. Now notice this difference. It's quite interesting that the members of the Senate have to be 5 years older than members of the House. In a later lesson, we'll talk about the implications of that. But for right now, just note that that may not seem that big of a difference to us in our modern times. It also might not seem that, it may seem a little bit surprising that people can serve as young as 25 or 30 because that seems so young by our modern standards too. But you have to remember that in 1788, when the Constitution was written, the average life expectancy was 36. Even somebody who had lived to adulthood could only expect to live on average for another 20-25 years. Now, there certainly were people back then that lived as long as they do today, particularly the more wealthy, healthy people in society. But the average age of death was young, and so as a consequence, somebody being 25, 30, 35 years old was at least at middle age by that point. It was assumed that they would be married, that they had children, that they had their own career, things like that. And so with people dying on average at such a young age, 5 years difference between the Senate and the House was a significant amount. So the Senate was assumed to be older and hopefully wiser because of the older required age for them. So let's summarize the difference in qualifications for the House and the Senate. To serve in the Senate, the person has to be at least 30 years old and have been a citizen of the United States for 9 years. To serve in the House, the person needs to be at least 25 years of age and have been a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. Which branch originally was considered the most powerful? Was it the legislative branch, the executive branch, the bureaucratic branch, or the judicial branch? Of course, it's the legislative branch because they're the ones that make the law that the executive then carries out and the judiciary judges whether people have obeyed or not. So it all comes back to the legislative branch. What is a bicameral legislature? Is it a legislature that's representative of the people, or one that's composed of two houses, or one that's limited in its size, or one that's assigned broad powers? A bicameral legislature is composed of two houses. How is the Senate composed? Is it based on population? Do they have 435 total members? Are there 2 senators from each state? Or does the composition actually change every 10 years? In the Senate, each state is represented by 2 senators. How is the House selected? Do 1/3 of them come up for election every 2 years? Are they selected for 6-year terms? Are they chosen by their state legislatures? Are they voted in by the people? The House of Representatives is voted in by the people of their states. And what is a Senate qualification? Is it that a person getting elected to the Senate must be at least 30 years of age, or 25 years of age, or 35 years of age, or at least 21 years of age? You have to be at least 30 years of age to serve in the United States Senate. Right, that does it for this lesson, which was lesson 1 of Unit 4. Next will be lesson 2 of Unit 4, in which we'll talk about differences between these houses.